Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew. Each week, I answer a film-related question submitted by one of you, our BMFI patrons. If you have a question you're interested in, please visit the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and look for the Ask Andrew question. Who knows? Maybe next week I'll be answering one of your questions. Now, on to today's question. Joe asks, does the decision to make a film black and white come before filming or is it done after? Well, Joe, the use of black and white in film, as you know, was not always a question of choice. For many years, black and white was the default setting for narrative cinema around the world, and particularly in Hollywood, from cinema's inception in the 1890s, really until the early 1960s. However, there were certainly color options that were available during that time. During the earliest days of cinema, color was applied to films by hand tinting. This term is kind of used to cover two different techniques. One is literally going frame by frame and painting on the film, let's say a man's coat blue. And you would have to find that coat in each frame of the film, and literally someone would paint it blue. In the early days of the movies were very short, so that wasn't as insurmountable as it might seem, but it was still obviously a big pain. The other way color was sort of applied was through tinting whole sections of movies, usually to reflect sort of the setting, the time of day. You would have sections of movies tinted blue to show they were happening at night, tinted yellow or gold to show they were happening in an early morning. And sometimes, like in the black and white portions of The Wizard of Oz, they would be tinted with a sort of sepia tone to look older or sort of more warm or more worn. But from really the early 1930s, there were color filming processes, but they were more involved and more expensive than shooting in black and white. There was first 2-strip Technicolor and then 3-strip Technicolor that allowed a color image to be captured by the motion picture camera, but it required the use of special cameras that were bigger. It required using multiple strips of film, hence the name 2-strip or 3-strip, and that made it more expensive. And because the process was so particular, you had to have an extra crew member, a Technicolor consultant, on the set with you. So it was a much more involved process and therefore costlier, and so it would only be used for certain types of movies. And so the decision was made in advance because it would impact budget and other things to an extent, like costuming and choice of cinematographer perhaps, and other things. So that decision, once color became a real option for Hollywood, was always made in advance. And frankly, the technology required it. Even once single strip color processes became possible in the 50s and started being used more widely in the 1960s, there was still a choice that had to be made based on, among other things, the genre, the budget of the film, and in some cases a cinematographer, although any cinematographer worth his or her salt should be able to do a good job in black and white or color. But Hollywood movies were sort of by default black and white, at least until the early 60s. And then color started to become more common and expected. And as I said, the single strip process became available, so it became of comparable cost. And that meant that Hollywood movies starting in the mid-1960s or so were pretty much always color. That being said, then, choices had to be made in advance based on what film stock you were going to purchase, and perhaps your cinematographer and a few other things regarding the production. But the biggest issue regarding black and white during that time would have been budget, because movies, once color became the standard, movies that were shot in black and white tended to not perform as well at the box office. So if filmmakers, the producer, and the director were going to decide or agree to shoot a film in black and white, they would probably expect less of a box office return than they might otherwise, which would impact budgeting, which would probably impact a number of aspects of the production. So they would want to make that decision in advance, even if it didn't mean needing different film stock and perhaps some other elements of the physical production. Now that starts to change with the advent of computers being used as an integral, essential part of the Hollywood filmmaking process. It starts in the 1990s when movies are still being shot on film stock, but computers greatly facilitated the possibility of shooting a film on color with color film stock, and then either digitally removing the color during the post-production process, or at least facilitating the making of black and white prints from that color film. In fact, Schindler's List is an interesting example on this front. Universal Studios chair Tom Pollock really begged Steven Spielberg and cinematographer Janusz Kaminski to shoot the film in color and then make black and white prints from that color negative to be shown in the theater, because Pollock wanted to have color versions of the film to sell to television and to sell on, at the time, VHS for home video. And he knew the movie would do much better that way. And from his perspective, he was spending something like $100 million at the time on a 3-hour black and white Holocaust movie with no stars. And even though it was directed by Steven Spielberg, he didn't think he had a very good shot of getting his money back. So he wanted to have the ability to release to television and home video color versions to help sort of make back some of that money. Now, that turned out to be an entirely moot point. Color versions of the film, to my knowledge, were never made available, either on home video or for television. But it ended up not mattering because Spielberg refused, as it turns out, to shoot with a color negative. He and cinematographer Janusz Kaminski were concerned that sometimes when a film is shot on a color negative and then black and white prints are made, there's sometimes a slight pinkish tint or undertone to the black and white. And that would be just, a terrible disaster for any movie that was intending to be just in black and white, but particularly in this film. So despite some rumors to the contrary, it appears that they never actually shot with the color negative. And so the ability to release sort of authentically filmed color versions doesn't exist. Now, could the film be colorized like was happening in the 80s and early 90s when Ted Turner bought the MGM library? Yes, but there's no need to do that. Schindler's List has been an enormously successful film. It is now viewed as a classic and an important movie, and that would never happen. And while I think that computer technology would allow films to be turned from black and white to color with a bit more fidelity and realism than was done in the 80s and 90s, today, it doesn't seem to be something that's of interest to people. So while the technology exists, and now that films since the mid 2000s or the late 2000s are shot digitally, it's much easier to make the choice about black and white or color after the fact. I have no doubt that a film could be shot one way and changed into the other. If it's shot digitally and with the use of computers in post-production, that would probably be pretty easy. But I still don't think it would happen because the financial concerns that I mentioned earlier still exist. Black and white movies still tend to do not as well at the box office, not as well on television, not as well on streaming and subsequent ancillary markets. And so that decision would impact the budgeting of the film because it would impact the investment someone would think they could receive after the film's released. And so the decision still would be made in advance. So now, while I think the decision could more easily be made after the fact, it still, for all intents and purposes, is going to be made before the fact. So I guess the short answer, and I didn't give a short answer, but I guess the short answer to your question is, yes, it's always made before filming starts and not after. but hopefully I gave you some additional background on the matter, and hopefully that's of interest. If you have a film-related question you would like to get an answer on, please visit the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and submit it using the Ask Andrew form. Who knows? Next time maybe I'll be answering one of your questions.